Hi folks, this is Ron. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a stub bend in a 1/2 inch piece of EMT conduit here using an IDEAL conduit bender. Now, when you look at the stub bends, which is probably the most common bend you'll find on a job site, it's really nothing more than a 90-degree bend in a piece of conduit. And contractors use it for all kinds of applications, like feeding electrical outlet boxes from conduit in the floor, but there's many purposes for it. And you'll notice on the heads of the benders that there's a graduated marks for 10 degree, 22 and a half, 30, 45, and 60 degree bends, depending on what you're trying to get accomplished here. Say I want to make a 14-inch stub on this. Again, the bender here says 5 inches, the stub's 5 inches to the arrow, right? So I'm going to make a mark at 14 inches minus 5 inches, or 9 inches on my conduit here, okay? Now, to test to make sure that this is actually bending the way we want it to, I'm going to take a known piece of conduit here that is 48 inches long. And I've made a mark on it at 9 inches from one end, okay? That leaves 39 inches left over on this 48 inch piece of conduit. Now, typically when you're making a mark on a conduit, you're going to use pencil, not pen, and that way you can actually erase it once you've installed it. I'm going to use a permanent marker here so you can actually see the darn thing, okay? And typically electricians are taught to mark the conduit all the way around the conduit so that they can actually see it and the mark doesn't get lost in the bender head. Now, the next thing you're going to do is to line up that mark with the arrow, and it says 5 stub inches to the arrow. So I'm going to find the arrow mark, which is by the hook in the front of the bender head there, and very carefully line up that mark with that arrow on the bender head. Now, stubs are typically done on the ground, as I say, or on the floor. So we're going to take this piece of conduit, I'm applying a little pressure to the bender head so it doesn't move on me here, and then I'm going to step on the back end of the piece of conduit and kind of get my body weight low, step on the heel of the back of the bender. And when you bend it, you want to bend it consistently with firm pressure so you don't get any wrinkles or kinks in that bender or in that conduit run, okay? Now, when do you know you're 90 degrees? Well, the answer to that is a little experience and some good eyeballs. And so we'll bend that to 90 degrees, and obviously if we underbend it, we can bend it a little bit more. Or if you've overbent it, the handle has an opening on one end, so I can slide over top of that and actually tweak that, one way or another if I had to, okay? So let's take a look and see how we did with that piece of conduit, all right? Well, I'm going to line that piece of conduit up here with my ruler. And when I do that, you're going to see that's right at 14 inches. So actually that bender head is pretty accurate at 5 inches, and I think you'll find that true with the IDEAL benders. Now, if it was 5 1/4, you'd make a mark at 5 1/4 on the bender someplace to let you know that it's not quite the 5 inches, right? So then let's measure the tail, okay? Now, when we measure the tail, you'll see that's right at 36 1/2 inches, okay? Now, what that means to me is this, we started, if you look at the two distances we just measured, we had 36 1/2, and we also had 14, okay? If you add those together, that comes up to 50 inches, 50 1/2, I should say, right? Now, we started with 48, okay? So that's what we call the gain amount, and the difference, obviously, is 2 1/2 inches, right? Well, that's useful to know for this particular bender head, because say I need to make a bended piece of conduit, and here's my fitting that I'm measuring from, and here's the wall, right? And this distance between the two is 22 inches, say. And we want to bend a 14-inch stub in the conduit. So as I said earlier, the electricians don't bend the conduit and cut it to length. What they know now is that we need a piece of conduit that's 22, which is that distance. We need it to be a stub that's 14, and we know the gain amount here is 2 1/2, okay? So if we add all that up, that ends up being 38 1/2 inches, okay? So now we know that we will cut a piece of conduit 38 1/2 inches long, and when we make that bend, it'll actually fit this application that we need it to fit for, okay? Now, this gain amount can also be referred to as the tail take-up amount, if you want to, or back-end take-up amount, which, again, is the same thing as this 48. So if you see, we had 39 inches to begin with, 39 inches minus your 36 and a half, which is actually what the tail was after we get done bending it, you still see that's going to equal 2.5 inches. Okay, so you'll see that they're the same. Okay, so we gained a little bit in the run, and we lost that amount in the tail end of that piece of conduit. The offset bend is used when an obstruction requires a change in the direction of a piece of conduit or the plane of the conduit. And it's actually just two bends in the length of conduit that allow that conduit to get over the obstruction and continue along the length or along its path. Now, before making the offset, you must choose the appropriate angles you want to use here for the offset. And keeping in mind that shallower bends make for easier wire pulling, steeper bends will conserve a little space in here, but they're also a little harder to pull through as well. So, and for small kicks of just 1 or 2 inches that feed, say, an electrical outlet box, a 10-degree offset is generally probably used. For obstructions between, say, 1 to 6 inches or so, 22.5 or 30-degree angles work out best usually. And if the obstruction gets to 8 or 10 inches or more, probably a 45 or 60-degree bend might be recommended. However, any of these angles could be used to create this offset. Since you're actually bending angles in a length of conduit here, believe it or not, trigonometry comes into play here. And depending on the degree of bend you're doing and the height of your obstruction, a certain amount of what we call shrink amount and a distance between the bends is going to have to get calculated. Now, I'm working with a length of conduit that I know is 60 inches long here. Now, because of the two bends you're going to put in it, in order to create the offset, the overall length of the conduit will shrink by a certain amount, which is, again, dependent upon the degree of bend you're dealing with, and, again, the height of the obstruction you're dealing with. Now, 30-degree bends are pretty common out there, and the shrink amount is 1/4 inch for every inch of obstruction you're going over, and the multiplier is 2. So the math gets kind of easy on a 4-inch obstruction over here. We know 4 times the 1/4 inch, which is the 1 inch of shrink we're going to have, and 2 times 4, which is going to be the distance between the bends. Now, on a 10-degree kick, the shrink amount is only about a 1/16 of an inch, so it's kind of negligible, and the multiplier is 6. When we get down to 22.5-degree bends, the shrink amount gets up to be 3/16 of an inch for every inch of obstruction you're going over, and the multiplier is 2.6. 45-degree, the shrink amount is 3/8 of an inch, and the multiplier is 1.4. And for those bigger 60-degree bends, 1/2 inch of shrink, and the multiplier is 1.2. Okay. Now, we make this easy by providing you with an offset bending guide on the handle of every ideal conduit bender, so you don't have to do the math. Now, looking at that offset bending guide, for a 4-inch obstruction and using two 30-degree bends, the guide gives us a shrink amount of 1 inch and a distance between the bends of 8 inches. That's perfect. Again, we don't have to do the math. That follows along with the shrink amount and the multiplier given for a 30-degree bend with a 4-inch obstruction. Again, 4 times the 1/4 inch, or the 1 inch for the shrink, and the height of the obstruction is 4. 4 times 2 is 8 inches for the distance between the bends. Now, step 1 is to measure the distance from the last coupling you're dealing with, piece of conduit, out to obstruction you need to get over. In my example, I'm going to say that's 36 inches, okay? Now, step 2 is to add that shrink amount that the table gave us to that measured distance, okay? And so you're going to make a mark on your conduit at 36 plus 1, or 37 inches. So from this end here, I've measured out, and I'm at 37 inches going to make a mark. Now, contractors generally use a pencil to make that mark on a conduit, so it actually can be erased somewhere down the road. In my example, I'm going to use a permanent marker and mark the conduit all the way around the conduit. And I do that because then the mark will not get lost in the bender head when you're actually doing the bending here in a minute or two. Now, step 3 is to make the second mark on the conduit. Now, remember that this mark is going to what we call back up from the first mark, okay? Not add to, we're going to back up. And the distance between bends is 8 inches. So 37 minus 8 is at 29 inches. So I'm going to make another mark at 29 inches on my conduit here, and that's going to be the distances between the two bends. Now, offsets are typically done in the air, not on the ground. And you're going to simply stand the bender down with the handle down, the head kind of close to you. And step 4 is to line that 37-inch mark up with the arrow in the bender head here, okay? And make sure it's lined up pretty tight with it. And you can use the graduated marks on the side of the bender head here to know when you bent the conduit to 30 degrees. And the bottom of the conduit here will be even with that mark when you have bent it to that 30-degree mark. Now, to do this bend, I'm going to place one foot down here down here by the bottom of the handle, and I'm going to lean the conduit bender a little bit away from me as well. Okay. And when I apply pressure to the conduit, I want to get my arm over here tight so I can apply pressure close to the bender head. If I'm out here and I'm applying pressure to the conduit, I'm going to end up with a bow in the conduit, which is what you don't want to do. So I'm going to make sure it's lined up. Then I'm going to make that bend, and using constant pressure, bend this to 30 degrees. Okay, there we go. All right. Now, step 5 is to slide the conduit down the conduit head and rotate the conduit 180 degrees. Okay, and then you're going to line up that second mark with the arrow on the bender head. Okay. Now, another tip is that everything you just bent is in front of you on the other side of the bender head. Okay, and you want to make sure that you line up the 2 bends before making this second bend. And you can use the handle here to align the first bend with the second bend. Okay, and just kind of sight your way down it. Okay, and you want to be careful to line up those 2 bends because if you don't, you'll end up with what they call a dog leg. And you know, anytime you have 2 or more bends in a piece of pipe, there's the potential for what electricians call a dog leg, where the 2 pipes aren't aligned properly. And this creates problems when you actually go to install it in the wall. And of course, on top of that, it doesn't look for a very professional looking bend either. So now, then I'm going to use a similar technique and make the second 30-degree bend in this piece of conduit, okay? And create this 4-inch offset. There we go. And there's my 4-inch offset, okay? Now, using a tape measure, we can check the accuracy of the bender, and you can see that the offset is right at about 36 inches away from the end of the conduit, which would clear the obstruction. And the depth or height of the offset is at 4 inches. And you also notice that the overall length of the conduit, which started out at 60 inches, is now just 59 inches. And the difference is that 1 inch of shrink that we allowed for when we made our first mark at 37 inches. Hi folks, it's Ron with IDEAL. In this video, I'm going to show you one way to make a box offset bender in a 1/2-inch piece of EMT conduit here, using a hand conduit bender from IDEAL. Now, a box offset bend is needed anytime an electrician needs to feed an electrical box with a piece of conduit like this one over here, okay? And the deal is the knockout on the side of the box is not flush with the back of the box. Hence, the conduit must be bent in a slight shape like that so it can be inserted into the conduit fitting on the side of the box. Now, this allows the conduit to be mounted flush up against the wall or the concrete and without putting any undue stress on the conduit fitting or on the box itself. Generally, a 10-degree offset bend is used to create this box offset, and it's actually 2 10-degree bends you're going to put in the conduit. And many contractors in the field have done this enough that they're just going to make a couple marks on that conduit, and they're going to have that offset bent before you even know it, okay? But if you remember my video on offset bends, a certain shrink amount and a certain multiplier is used to create all of the different offsets that you're working with, okay? Now, on a 10-degree offset bend, the shrink amount is only about a 1/16 of an inch for every inch of obstruction you're going to go over, and the multiplier is 6, which is going to be used to calculate the distance between the 2 bends or the 2 marks I'm going to make on my conduit. Now, on a typical electrical outlet box, the knockout's about 3/8 of an inch away from the back of the box. Now, that becomes the height of the obstruction that we're going to need to overcome, okay? So 6 times 3/8 of an inch is 2 1/4 inches, and that becomes the distance between the 2 bends or the 2 marks I'm going to make on this piece of conduit. And in this case, the shrink amount is so small, it's not even a factor. We weren't going to worry about it, okay? Now, to make the box offset on the end of a piece of conduit, I'm actually going to make 2 marks on the end of the conduit. And step 1 is to make the first mark about 2.5 inches, 2.5 inches away from the end of the conduit. If I make the mark, right close at the end of the conduit, the hook on the bender may actually deform the round shape of the conduit, and then the conduit is not going to fit inside the box or the fitting that's on the side of the box, okay? So contractors generally use a pencil to make that mark on the conduit so it can be erased later down the road. In my example, I'm going to use a permanent marker, and I'm going to mark the conduit all the way around the conduit, and that way the mark on the conduit will not get lost in the bender head when I'm doing my bending here in another minute or so, okay? Now, for the 3/8 inch offset, we calculated the distance between the two bends to be 2¼ inches. So I'm going to make a second mark on my conduit at 2¼ inches away from that first mark on the conduit, okay? And again, I'm going to mark the conduit all the way around, all right? Now, offset bends are done in the air, not on the ground. So very simply, you're going to take your conduit bender, you're going to point the handle down like that, with the head kind of closer to you here. And then step 2 is to insert that conduit into the bender head, and you're going to line up that first mark with the arrow on the side of the bender, okay? Then bend your knees slightly like that, kind of lower your center of gravity. Place one foot up against the bender boot down there so it doesn't slide on you when you make the bend, and tilt the bender a little bit away from me. And then using constant pressure, I'm going to bend that first bend to 10 degrees. Now, when do you know you're at 10 degrees? Well, again, the bottom of the conduit will be even with that 10-degree mark on the side of the bender head, okay? Now, step 3 is to slide the conduit down to the second mark, okay? And again, line up the second mark with the arrow on the side of the bender head. And then you're going to rotate the conduit 180 degrees, okay? And you're going to line up the two bends using the handle on the bender here to line up the two different bends. And then using constant pressure again, I'm going to bend that to, again, 10 degrees. Okay, very good. Now this creates the box offset in that conduit that allows that to easily slide into the conduit fitting on the side of the box. Hi folks, it's Ron with IDEAL. In this video, I'm going to show you one way to make a 3-bend saddle bend in a 1/2 inch piece of EMT conduit here using a hand conduit bender from IDEAL. Now, the 3-bend saddle bend is kind of similar to an offset bend in the fact that you're going over an obstruction, but in this case, you're going to bend the conduit back down to the same plane, so to speak. And it's used most often when an obstruction like a piece of pipe is encountered, like along the length of a wall someplace. And it's actually 3 bends in that length of conduit you're going to make in order to create that saddle so that obstruction can go, conduit can go over the obstruction and continue along its path, okay? Now, most commonly, you might use a 45-degree center bend here and then 2 22-degree bends on either side of that. But you could use a 60-degree bend and then 2 30-degree bends if you cared to. And you're going to use the same calculations for either set of angles, and you're going to need to make actually 3 marks on your conduit to make these 3 bends. And I'm also going to be working with a known length of conduit that I know is 60 inches long here, okay? But because of the 3 bends we're going to put into it, it's to create that saddle, the overall length of the conduit will shrink by a little bit, and it's actually 3/16 of an inch for every 1 inch of obstruction that you're going to go over. Now, in this case, the obstruction is this 2-inch piece of PVC pipe I've got here, which actually has an outside diameter of more like 2 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to create a 3-inch saddle bend to go over that particular obstruction, okay? Using a 45-degree center bend and then 2 22.5-degree bends on either side of that. Now, using the chart in the IDEAL bending guide for the saddle bends, I can see for a 3-inch obstruction, I'm going to move my center mark ahead by 9/16 of an inch. Now, that makes sense because we said 3/16 for every inch, and we got a 3-inch obstruction, and that makes the 9/16 of an inch that's going to, we're going to add, which is the shrink amount, so that we can add that to make this center mark here, okay? Now, the chart also says the other 2 marks on either side of the center bend should be at 7.5 inches away from the center bend, and that's going to be my 3 marks. So step 1 is to measure the distance you're working with from the last coupling to the center of the obstruction you're dealing with. So the last piece of conduit to the center of the obstruction, and let's say in my example that's 30 inches. So step 2 is to add the shrink amount from the table to that measured distance and make my first mark from the end of the conduit here at 30 9/16 of an inch, okay? Now, contractors typically are going to use a pencil to make that mark so they can erase it somewhere down the road. In my example, I'm going to use a permanent marker and mark the conduit all the way around the conduit so the mark will not get lost in the bender head when I go to do the bending here in a minute. And the other 2 marks are going to be made at 7.5 inches on either side of the center mark, and again, mark the conduit all the way around so, again, doesn't get lost in the bender head. Now, saddle bends are done in the air, not on the ground. So you're going to simply stand the bender up with the handle down like that and the head kind of closer to you like this, okay? And step 3 is to line the center mark up with the rim notch in the bender head here, okay? And the rim notch is what we call the center of the bend. And then you're going to, bend your knees and kind of lower your center of gravity and step one foot up against the handle so it doesn't end up slipping away from it. I got to kind of lean against away from me. And using constant pressure, I'm going to get kind of close to the bender head here so I can put constant pressure and bend the conduit to 45 degrees, okay, to prevent any wrinkles and kinks. So you don't want to bend out here because you'll end up with a bow kind of in your conduit, which is what you don't want. And how do I know I'm at 45 degrees again? Well, the bottom of the conduit will be even with that 45-degree mark on the bender head when you've got it at 45 degrees. Now, step 4 is to slide the conduit down and line up that outer mark that's kind of closest to you with the arrow on the bender head this time. Keeping in mind that everything you've bent is on that side of the bender head, okay? And for both of these two outer bends, you're going to always want to make sure your hook is actually facing the center bend of the saddle here, okay? And then you're going to rotate the conduit 180 degrees, okay? And again, make sure you're on that arrow mark, okay? Now, you're going to use the handle of the bender to kind of line up these two bends here, okay? You can actually sight down the handle itself and see them. And anytime you've got two or more bends in a length of conduit like this, there's the potential for what electricians call a dog leg, where the two bends are not aligned properly. And obviously that causes some issues when we go to install it in a wall and doesn't make for a very professional looking kind of bend. And then using firm pressure, I'm going to bend this conduit to, again, 22.5 degrees. That's a little more. There we go. All right, very good. Now, we're going to take the conduit, step 5, is to take the conduit completely out, and you're going to flip it around here. And you're going to line up that last outer mark up again with the arrow on the bender head. And again, everything I've bent is already, again, on that side of the bender head. And again, my hook is facing the center bend here again of the saddle, okay? And then again, I'm going to use the handle to line up all three of these bends. You can, again, sight right down that to do that. Again, I'm on the mark. And then go ahead and bend that to using constant pressure to, again, 22.5 degrees. Okay. Now this creates the 3-bend saddle that easily goes over this obstruction. And you can see that the bottom of the conduit will clear a 3-inch obstruction. Also, the middle of the center bend is right about 30 inches from the end of the conduit. So it's going to fit this application without needing to cut the conduit to length. And the overall length of 60 inches has been reduced to, and is about 9/16 of an inch shorter, which was the shrink amount we allowed for the center of the bend to be over that obstruction. Now, folks, it's Ron with IDEAL. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a back-to-back bend in a 1/2-inch piece of EMT conduit here. A back-to-back bend is when we need to make a second stub bend, typically in a length of conduit, to produce a U shape in that piece of conduit to fit between a couple obstructions. Or you could possibly use it to make an S shape out of the conduit as well, in case you need to, say, add down a wall. So you can use this bend for conduit that runs across the floor or ceilings, which turns up or down that wall. Now, it's really just 2 stub bends in that length of conduit that have been bent to fit that application, okay, without having to cut and fit multiple pieces of conduit together to actually make that happen. Now, after the first stub bend, 90-degree stub bend has been made in that piece of conduit, and again, it's just a basic stub bend, step 1 is to determine the length between the 2 obstructions and make the marks on your conduit. So to do that, we're going to determine the length between here and the back of the second bend here, okay? And it could be between 2 obstructions or from the outside edges of a couple knockouts on some boxes. Now, in my example, that's going to be 30 inches. So I'm going to measure from the outside edge of this piece of conduit here and make a mark at 30 inches on the conduit, which I've already actually done. And that mark is the back of the second bend, okay? Now, contractors typically are going to use a pencil to mark the conduit so it can be erased, somewhere down the road. Here I'm going to use a permanent marker so I can see it, and I'm going to mark the conduit all the way around the conduit so the mark doesn't get lost in the bender head. Now, step 2 is to line that mark up with the tip of the star you'll find in the middle of the bender head here, or shoe, okay? And that star indicates the back of this second bend, okay? And you're going to want to also make sure that the hook of the bender is facing away from the first bend, so the bender's going in the right direction, so to speak, so to be able to make this U shape out of this particular piece of conduit. And step 3 is to lay that conduit on the ground. And so I'm going to firmly hold a little pressure against the handle here, so the marks are not going to slip the conduit's not going to slip on me as I lay it to the ground. I'm going to apply some firm pressure to the back of the conduit with this 1 foot here, okay? Now, the next step is to carefully line up the first 90-degree bend you made up with the second 90 we're going to make here, okay? And if the two are not aligned properly, you'll end up with what they call a dog leg. And I can use the bender handle to kind of help align those two up and make that as straight as I can. And anytime you've got 2 or more bends going on in a piece of pipe, the potential for that dog leg exists. And if the bends aren't aligned properly, that creates kind of a problem in the wall when you go to install it, and it doesn't make for a professional looking bend either. Okay? Now that I've got the marks all lined up and the bends are aligned together, step 4 is to actually make the bend. Now to do that, I'm going to lower my body weight a little bit here and get my center of gravity down, and then I'm going to step with my other foot on the serrated edge on the heel on the back of that bender head, okay? Now, we're going to use constant firm pressure and bend the conduit to 90 degrees using the bender head or the shoe. Now, when do you know you're at 90 degrees there? Well, the answer is a little experience goes a long way here. Now, luckily, the bender handle here is flared on one end here, so if you've underbent or overbent that piece of conduit or that stub, you can tweak it one way or another. And you can also use that to help straighten out any dog leg you might actually have in this piece of conduit after you've bent it. Now remember, constant heavy foot pressure is critical to keep the conduit in the bender groove and to prevent any kinked or wrinkled conduit at the end of the day there, okay? So let's check the accuracy of this particular bender, and let's measure this distance between the outside edges of these two pieces, or this one piece of conduit here. Now as you can see, that measures right around 30 inches, and it's a pretty accurate bend. So remembering this technique can be used anytime a second stub bend is needed in a length of conduit.